Okay, so with regard to the board, we're currently at 24 members. By charter, we can go up to as many as 25. 4 of those members are nominated by the Association of Rice Alumni. So the way that works is the ARA makes a nomination, presents that nomination to the board, and the board typically accepts the ARA nomination. It would be very rare that the board would not accept the ARA nomination. Sometimes the ARA will make multiple nominations, and if the board has a specific need, which is to say we're light on people in biosciences, and the ARA has made 2 nominations, and one of them is a biosciences expert, we would tend towards the biosciences. But the point being, the ARA plays a very important role in nominating members of the board. The other members of the board are nominated in the trustees committee, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. Of our current board members, of the 24 board members, 18 are Rice graduates. Of those 18, 15 have undergraduate degrees, 3 have graduate degrees. Of the 24 board members, 14 live in Houston, 3 others live in Texas, and 2 live outside of the United States. I would say at the moment, we probably have fewer non-Texas U.S. board members than we've had recently. This does tend to go a bit in cycles, but generally speaking, we're very focused on geographic diversity, given the importance of international reach in our academic mission. So I referred to this, but nominations to the board are made by the trustees committee of the board. This is a 10-member committee. And the board chair, currently Jim Crownover, and the president, David, serve as ex officio members of the trustees committee. These nominations that come out of the trustees committee require full board approval, and they are described and debated at the full board level. So it's not as if a subgroup of just 10 are deciding who new board members will be. The board broadly, and certainly the trustees committee, is very conscious of the areas of strategic importance to Rice, and a few examples of those would be relationships in Silicon Valley, relationships with the Texas Medical Center and biosciences broadly defined, the energy industry given where we're located and the academic mission of the university, as well as geographic, gender, and ethnic diversity focuses. We're also very focused on making sure that we maintain some balance between continuity and renewal. So by that, I mean that every year, on average, the board turns over by about 15%. Most people serve 8 years, so 2 4-year terms. So on average, the board is completely turning over every decade or so. Now, that's actually a big difference to what had happened at Rice for the previous 60 or 70 years, where the board was effectively static. With governance changes that Bill Barnett instituted about a decade ago now, we've gone to a much more dynamic, if you will, policy with regard to board renewal, and I think very much to the benefit of the university. Another consideration is that the board is critical to philanthropic success. Now, this is not meant as code for, if you're on the board, you better give a lot of money, nor is it meant to suggest that unless you are capable of large philanthropic support of Rice, you cannot or would not be considered as a board member. Neither of those two things are true. That being said, if you think about our current capital campaign, for example, we would expect at the end of this billion-dollar campaign to have something around 20% of the total funds raised in the campaign to have come from current board members or past board members. That's a lot of money in the context of Rice, in the context of a billion-dollar campaign. So while often we have board members who are not really capable of major philanthropic giving, we certainly do expect our board members to be leaders in philanthropy, and we take that into consideration as we're thinking about how the board is constituted. What I would say is that we are very fortunate to have a board at Rice that operates with a high level of mutual trust and respect and candor, which is as it should be, frankly, and it is as we would expect it to be at Rice, given the culture of our institution. And the view of our board chair, Jim Crownover, and of the board broadly is it is very important to Rice institutionally that it remains so. So how's the board organized? What do we do? The board is organized by committee in a very sort of traditional sense. I've listed the committees of the board here. They include academic affairs, audit, buildings and grounds, et cetera. In each one of these committees, there is a senior administration person responsible for leadership of the committee. In the case of building and grounds, for example, Kevin Kirby, along with Barbara and the B&G team, really leads or drives the committee. Linda Thrain in external relations, Kathy Collins in finance, et cetera. In addition to these committees, we also have two groups, the Rice Management Company, which, as you know, is a newly formed format, if you will, for the management of our endowment. And then the Campaign Cabinet, which was formed specifically for the purpose of executing our centennial campaign. So they are not technically standing committees of the board per se, but in effect work closely with the members of the board. The committees meet alongside each full board meeting. So board meetings are typically 2 days long, Wednesday and most of Thursday, 4 times a year. The committees meet on Wednesday. Most board members serve on, almost everyone serves on at least 2 committees, and in some cases as many as 4 committees. And this is really where the sort of meat and potatoes, if you will, of governance happen. Our committees are very engaged, very active. Many of the committees, particularly the finance and audit committees, also meet telephonically, much more often than simply quarterly alongside the main board meetings. So in that sense, it's very sort of traditional board governance. Action happens in the committees, and board members are expected to be very engaged and informed. So within that context, what does the board do? Well, our first rule is do no harm. I think the going-in assumption of those of us on the Rice board, and I would guess that this has been true for quite a long time, is that we've got a great thing going here. We have one of the finest higher education institutions in the world, and we need to make sure we don't screw it up. So the first job of the board is to make sure that we don't screw it up. That being said, I think all of us feel that there are plenty of things that we can and should do better, and we view very much as part of our charge to try to make that happen. Now, Rich Stanzidis is in the room, so I'm gonna venture on his territory here. But I thought it might be helpful for you guys to hear a little bit about how we think about our duties. And this is, in some sense, highly legalistic, but I think it actually does capture, broadly speaking, how a Rice trustee thinks about what he is supposed to be doing on the Rice board. The first is that we would consider ourselves to have a duty to act in good faith, which is to say to exercise diligence, competence, and objectivity. A duty of care, which is to give full attention to one's duties, setting aside competing personal or professional interest. And a duty of obedience, which is to promote the mission of the university within legal limitations. There's a lot of overlap between those 3 things. I guess I would summarize them by saying this is serious business, and the trustees take this as very serious business. And I don't mean that just legally, although there is a legal component to it. I mean it in some sense really morally. It's serious business, and you should be confident that the Rice trustees take it that way. Finally, what does the board do? We are expected to be a tireless advocate for Rice. In Houston, in California, in London, in Hong Kong, and New York, wherever we are located, we want and need our trustees to be out in front as an advocate for our university, and the trustees take that responsibility very seriously as well. So, okay, all that duty stuff is fine, but what do you really do? Okay, so there are some things specifically that we really do, and then there's a lot specifically that we really don't do, and I'm going to talk about those as well. The first and most important thing that the board does is choose the president. Hopefully that doesn't happen all that often, but when it does happen, it is the most important role for the board to play. In addition to choosing the president, the board chooses the board chair, and that is a fairly democratic process, if you will, in which the full board is fully engaged in choosing the board chair. In addition to those two sort of core duties, it is the board's responsibility to insist on a strategic vision. And obviously in the context of David's V2C, we have had a very specific strategic vision to work with, and the board was highly engaged in that process, as was the broader Rice community. So when I say insist on a strategic vision, it's not as if there's been pushback from our administration around a strategic vision, because there hasn't been at all. But it's certainly the board's responsibility to make sure that going forward we have a vision of where we want to go. In the context of that vision, it's important that the board is structured consistent with that. And so an example would be if we really believe that we have a core strength in the biosciences, that our location next to the Houston Medical Center gives us a competitive advantage, that we intend to raise money around and devote significant resources to biosciences, then it is important that there be biosciences expertise on the board. It's important that we have board members who are also board members at the various Texas Medical Center institutions, et cetera. So when I say structure the board consistent with the vision, that would be an example. Understanding and monitoring policy. One of the things you figure out as a trustee of a university is there's actually a lot of policy around, and you're never going to fully understand or know all of it. But it is very important that you understand the important stuff, and there's actually a lot of important stuff. And I think there are certainly occasions for board members to influence policy and how that policy is formed and ultimately implemented. It's also a good example of the importance of understanding and implementing policy would be in risk management, generally speaking, and enterprise risk management being a very important role of boards, both in corporate America, in universities, and in nonprofit context. Making sure that policies and procedures are in place to handle risks of all sorts is a very, very important role for the board to play, and indeed our board is highly engaged in the risk management process at Rice. Setting goals and assessing performance is important, and I'm referring really specifically to the goals and the performance of the president. That happens at Rice in the Committee on Organizational Development. We call it CORD. You saw that on the earlier slide. And CORD's job, among other things, is to make sure that our president is clear about his own performance goals, and then we measure him against those goals and give him feedback around his performance. We don't do that for positions beyond the president. So we don't play that role at the level of the deans or the other administrative officers. That's really for the president to do, but we do that for the president. Learning the subtleties of complex issues, I've listed a few here: enrollment policies, budget process, student life, tuition and aid policies, risk assessment, and mitigation. There's a very fine line between learning the subtleties and inserting oneself inappropriately. And Doug Fauché, who's a really terrific trustee at Rice, has something that he calls NOFI, which is to say nose in, fingers out. And that really, I think, sums up very effectively how board members think about how deeply they should be involved in any one given topic or policy at Rice. That being said, these are very complex issues that obviously hugely impact the direction of the university. And so to give you an example, a big topic nationally at the moment is the issue of rising cost of education and the accessibility of students, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., to higher education of the first order. It's particularly a sensitive issue at Rice, given our history and culture, if you will, of being a place that's highly affordable relative to other comparable educations in the U.S. So as we've seen our cost creep up, both on a gross basis and on a net basis, it's been a very important issue for the board to know and understand why that is happening and to take a view as to how much is too much or how much is not enough relative to our ambitions, our budget requirements, but also relative to the culture and the mission of the university. The budget process obviously is central to the decisions that the board makes, because at the end of the day, deciding how to allocate scarce resources is an extremely important piece of the governance process, and you can't make those decisions without understanding at a very deep level what's happening in the budget. Much of that happens at the Finance Committee level with Kathy and her team, but these discussions are actually much broader than that because they have very, very large implications for the university, for our mission, and for our culture. So once we kind of understand the subtleties of all these issues, our job really is to lend advice and consent pursuant to that understanding. In many, many cases, we are lending that advice and consent in a reactive way, which is to say, whether it's someone in the administration, David, a dean, they will come to us as trustees and ask for our opinion, input, and help. And in other cases, we are lending that proactively, which is to say, in the context of a broader board meeting, whether it's an executive session or otherwise, board members will raise their hand and say, I am uncomfortable about X, Y, and Z. Help me understand why we are doing it that way. And so the board is highly engaged, if you will, in all matters related to budget, as you might imagine. Finally, what does the board really do? We raise money. As we know at Rice, given our model, philanthropy is very much the lifeblood, not just of our capital projects, but of our operating budget in many, many ways. And it is critical that our board be highly engaged in making sure that we have the resources to fund the institutional priorities of the university. So there is not a single board member who doesn't feel responsibility, and in most cases a real sense of urgency around that responsibility to help us raise money to accomplish our mission. And what does the board not do? Well, actually there's a lot that we don't do. For starters, we don't hire or fire people except the president. We hire and fire the president. That's the only person we hire or fire. Now, I will say that we are often recruited to serve on search committees, sometimes even to chair search committees, and we're often involved in recruiting and/or retention efforts of key administration people, or in many cases, key faculty members. That being said, the fundamental decision of who to hire and who to fire does not rest with individual trustees or at the board level broadly. It rests with the administration. Another important thing that we do not do is we do not interfere in tenure or enrollment decisions. These are two big, big no-nos when it comes to trustee involvement in the university, and I think critical, generally speaking. In fact, the joke, I see Chris Munoz here, the joke among trustees is if you really want to make sure that someone doesn't get in, the thing to do is ask a trustee to go be an advocate, and I say that, really, really tongue-in-cheek, because we obviously do see a lot of terrific people, and like any other Rice alum, we feel free to write a letter that says, I've just met so-and-so, and I think he's terrific, and I hope you will consider him. Similarly, the tenure process is completely inappropriate for trustees to insert themselves in that process, and that's a big no-no. Furthermore, the trustees do not speak for the university per se. We are very careful not to be seen as being a voice independent of the administration, if you will. There are obviously times when it's appropriate for the chair of the Board of Trustees to make public statements about Rice, but on the whole, it is really not the job of trustees to speak for the university per se. That's the job of administration, of David, of Linda, and of the administration of the university. Broadly speaking, it does not meddle in affairs that belong in the scope of administration, and this is where we use Doug Faucher's rule of NIFO, or nose in and fingers out. Now, this would imply that there are very bright lines here, and there are things that you absolutely don't do, and then there are other things that you absolutely do. Like most things in life, there's a lot of gray area, and very often some of this is quite unclear. But the rule of thumb as a trustee is, when in doubt, don't. Because the stories are legion at other universities where trustees confuse their role with that of administration, and it's almost never to the benefit of the institution. So, what is the Rice Board currently thinking? And I'm going to kind of pose these as questions because I would not at all claim that we have answers to any of them, but I'd be happy to talk about really all of them in Q&A. Where we start is whether we are positioned as we'd like to be, given the future of higher education in America and the world. Now, how's that for the basics? But ultimately, this is a very, very critical role for the board to play. We have a lot of expertise on our board from many different areas of the economy and many different parts of the world. And we do bring to the table, ultimately, not just a view, but many different views around where the world is going in many areas that are critical to Rice. So in that context, are we positioned as we'd like to be, or are we not? And in the areas where we are not positioned optimally, what should we do about it? So the whole discussion last year and the year before around Baylor College of Medicine would be a very, very good example of how the board was engaged in this question. We have been served plenty well by not having a big medical school, but the fundamental question was, will we be served as well in the next 20 years, 50 years, 100 years as we've been served historically? A very big and important strategic question for Rice, and the board was extremely engaged at that level. In the areas where we are well positioned, how do we make certain that we continue to be? And this refers to everything from disruptive technologies, distance learning. One of our big competitive advantages has been we have a fantastic, well-located campus that's a beautiful place to be. Well, all that probably matters more if being on a campus and coming and listening to classes in an auditorium is really the way that university students will continue to learn. If they don't learn that way 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 60 years from now, is our beautiful, well-located, highly groomed, highly invested campus as relevant as it used to be? These are big, difficult questions where we wouldn't claim to have the answer, but we certainly worry about it a lot and think about it a lot and give the administration our views. How do we maintain Rice's culture and distinctiveness in light of rapid change and disruption in the world around us? I think all of us at the board level really feel that Rice is something special, and it's what draws us to service. And as I said in the beginning, we kind of have this overarching view of do no harm. But we know the world is changing, and is changing very rapidly. So how do we preserve that distinctiveness and that unique culture, yet at the same time react to change in the way that we really are going to have to react to change if we want to continue to be relevant in the overall scheme of higher education in this country? I would say the other cultural issues that we are highly sensitive to include the one that I mentioned earlier, which is to say access to higher education by students regardless of means. That is viewed by the board as really central to who we are. A real focus on superior undergraduate teaching and education, we would view that as very central. A broadly based curriculum where we are trying to be something quite different from Caltech, and we're also trying to be something quite different from Amherst. That has been distinctive. It's what makes Rice Rice. Will we be able to do that in the next 50 years in the way that we've done in the last 50 years? A big open question. But our gut would tell us we sure want to try because it seems so central to who we are institutionally. Are we attracting the right kind of student, and are we doing the right things with them while they're here? This is a big, important question, and it's been a bit of a hobby horse of mine at the board level. And I'll give you a sense for the kind of things that we talk about here. In the context of our conversations with Baylor, one of the statistics that came out of that was that the percentage of students who apply to Rice who think that they at least have some interest in going to medical school is, Chris, 60%, something like that, 65%. And so as we were thinking about an even bigger step into the medical world, one of the things, I raised my hand and said, wow, we're already 65% of our incoming students are thinking they want to go to medical school. Or in light of our broader mission, is this too far of a tilt, just institutionally? And that leads to a broader discussion about, well, what kind of students are we trying to attract? Another topic is that we have now moved into a mode where, given our ambition, capital needs, et cetera, it takes a lot of money to accomplish what we institutionally want to accomplish. So we're in the process of raising $1 billion, which, assuming we get it done, and Darrow and I, of course, are assuming we're going to get it done, it will be one of the largest per capita capital campaigns that ever executed by a U.S. university. But as I hate to remind Darrell and David, all that means is a few years from now, we're going to be talking about a $2 billion campaign because we've sort of unleashed a beast, if you will. Amherst is not trying to be something like this. But we are, because we're a broad-based research university, and the implication of that is that it really takes a huge amount of money to compete on not just a national level, but an international level, if that's your ambition. Well, are we attracting the kind of students who become the kind of graduates, who generate the kind of wealth, who give back to the university to allow us ultimately to raise $2 billion in a campaign? Good question, right? And not an obvious answer to that question. Now, we historically have actually produced relatively few big business leaders. There are areas where we have produced leaders in great size, academia being a good example, but there are other areas where we've produced very few, and business, broadly speaking, would be one. Well, is that going to be more important in the next 50 years than it's been in the last 50 years? Well, it kind of depends what our ambition is, probably. Are we prepared to change our culture, to tilt slightly differently, to try to accomplish that? Well, you get very different opinions around that at the Rice board, and my guess is there would be very different opinions around that in this room. But it's a big, important strategic issue, and that's an example of the kind of issues that the board wrestles with. The second part of that, are we doing the right things with them while they are here? If you believe in education and the value of it, you have to say, well, what are we doing that's more important than that? If we're not really delivering on that, how could we ultimately truly be delivering on our mission? And so the board is, I think appropriately so, very focused on making sure that we are delivering on that, that when we get the students, we're doing everything that we can to turn them into leaders and highly productive citizens, not just of Houston and Texas, but of the world. That also goes back to this issue of access and affordability, and I would say that some of our competitors have a different point of view as to what the makeup of their student body should be given the philanthropic demands of the university. At Rice, we historically have been, philanthropy is a whole different issue. We're going to take the very best students that we can find, and we'll assume that over time, philanthropy is going to take care of itself. Well, the answer to that might be fine if you're trying to raise $100 million, but it might not be so fine if you're trying to raise $2 billion. But once again, that question goes very much to the core of how we've thought about our student body, how we think about affordability and accessibility, where they come from, who's paying full freight, who's not paying, Texas students versus out-of-state students, international students who are getting paid for by the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these issues really do have kind of trickle-on effects to the core mission of Rice and to our values, and they're the kind of issues that we are very engaged in. And finally, how do we pay for it all? Or more specifically, are we putting limited resources in the right places? Now, at the end of the day, the board is very much depending on the administration to suggest what we'd like to do about that. But if the board has a very different view strategically of where that is likely to take us, you can rest assured that the administration is going to hear about it from the board. Now, that would imply that there's been a lot of rancorous conversation around that, but actually there hasn't been at all. There's been fantastic alignment at the board level along the V2C and both the academic and research priorities of the university. That being said, we are very aware that we're creating a beast, if you will, that will consume a lot of capital over the course of the next several decades. We are obviously blessed to have a big endowment, but we are challenged by the fact that we insist, and quite rightly in my view, on continuing to be a broad-based research university of relatively small size. And as David says, our challenge in almost everything we do, whether it's the religious studies department or architecture or the opera studies program at the Shepherd School or you name it, football, the biggest challenge in everything we do is our size. And the board is keenly aware of that and constantly kind of pushing and pulling around the judgments that leads to. So when considering those questions, what matters most to the board? We are keenly aware that higher education is intensely competitive. I happen to be in a service business, and my greatest fear is the same fear that David Lebron wakes up with every morning, which is that all of his assets tend to go up and down an elevator every day, and they can easily just as easily walk off the campus and not come back as not. And therefore, we have to be very aware and responsive to competitive threats. And generally speaking, I think we are. A sort of follow-on to that is that we cannot be made irrelevant. There are, the stories are legion, not necessarily in higher education, but in other institutions of people who lost their relevancy via poor strategic choices. And I think particularly the business people on the board are extremely aware of that and focused on making sure that our strategic choices are the right choices and that we continue to stay relevant. Our ambitions must remain extremely high. Given our position and resources, we should be a world leader in higher education. This is an extremely important assumption, if you will, at the board level. Almost never do we have a broad-based board discussion in which there is a strong argument to lower our ambition at the university. Almost never. And you could argue maybe there should be more. But I think it's very telling that as great as the challenges are, we feel like we have big competitive advantages of all sorts, and that there's no reason that we shouldn't be a world leader in this field. We do believe that it's our values that bind the Rice community together, and that they have to be at the center of our response to all of these competitive threats. So I've touched on a few of those. Generally, they would be the things that all of us kind of know and understand are central to our culture and to our values. Sometimes those values actually get in the way of fairly expedient choices. And when they do, it's the responsibility of the board to refuse the expedient choice in favor of the value. But I would also say it's the responsibility of the board to be making strategic judgments along with the administration of the areas where the values might need to change a bit to make sure that we continue to be relevant. We must look forward. The world is changing, and what worked well for Rice in the past might not be well suited for Rice in the future. The medical school example would be one of those. And I don't have a long list of these. It's not as if we sit around at the board level and say, boy, this isn't going to work going forward. But rather we do sit around at the board level and say, you know, what are the implications of research that has really become so cross-dimensional, and where if you want to be good in imaging, you need to be great in computer science, but you also need to be good in geology. And if you're not good in geology and you're not good in computer science, how are you going to be good in imaging, right? Those kinds of conversations do happen at the board level, and I think ultimately can be helpful to our deans and our academic leaders as they're thinking about the future of their areas. So, you know, as trustees, we really do believe in the transformative power of Rice on the lives of our students and the impact it will have on Houston and the world. And so, you know, our job ultimately is to apply our collective knowledge, our imagination, and our dedication to help that transformative power and to impact and grow what the university is doing to its students and in the world.